The knock on the door came just after dusk, a timid scratching sound almost lost in the howl of the Montana wind. Out here, in the winter of 1872, the wind was the only regular visitor. It screamed across the plains, burying fences and freezing streams, a constant reminder that the world was vast and you were small. Silas Boone sat by his fire, the flames doing little to warm the cold that had settled deep in his bones years ago. He was a broad man, built of oak and iron, but his eyes held the emptiness of a house with no one left inside. His dog, a grizzled old hound named Jeb, lifted his head from the hearth, a low whine rumbling in his chest. Silas put a hand on the dog's head, a silent command to stay put. Visitors didn't come to this ranch, not anymore. The road was barely a memory under the snow, and the nearest neighbor was a hard day's ride, assuming you didn't freeze solid on the way. No one came out here unless they were lost, or unless they were looking for something. He grabbed the rifle that leaned against the stone fireplace, its weight familiar in his hands. He didn't bother with a lamp. He knew the layout of his home like the back of his own scarred hand. He moved through the shadows, each footstep silent on the rough-hewn floorboards. The scratching came again, more desperate this time. A human sound, a small sound. He reached the door, the cold from the oak seeping into his fingertips. He paused, listening. All he could hear was the wind and the frantic, terrified beating of his own heart. He hadn't felt that in a long, long time. Taking a deep breath, he slid the heavy bar lock aside. The sound was like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Then he pulled the door inward. The storm lunged into the house, a blast of ice and snow that made the fire spit and hiss. And in that swirling vortex of white stood a figure, more ghost than woman. She was wrapped in a shawl so thin it was a miracle it hadn't shredded in the wind. Her face was raw, her lips blue, but it was her eyes that held him. They were wide, dark, and filled with a terror that went far beyond the cold. Behind her, clinging to her worn dress, were three little girls, their faces pinched and pale, their eyes just as wide, just as haunted. The woman stumbled forward, her voice a cracked whisper. "Please, sir," she began, but a wave of dizziness seemed to take her, and she swayed. One of the children, the smallest, began to cry, a thin, weak sound that cut through the gale. Silas's first instinct, the one that had kept him alive this long, was to slam the door, to bar it shut and pretend he'd heard nothing but the wind. This was trouble. Trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he ran. But then he saw the little girl's face, cheeks hollowed out by hunger, eyes that had seen too much. And it wasn't just his own grief he saw reflected there, it was a mirror of a different failure, a different night, a memory he had tried to bury under years of silence and solitude. He couldn't leave them out there. Whatever they were running from, the storm would claim them first. "Get in," he growled, the words torn from his throat. The woman nearly collapsed with relief, ushering her children past him into the relative warmth of the cabin. Silas slammed the door, the bar falling back into place with a heavy thud. He sealed them in. He sealed himself in. And as he turned to face them, the firelight catching the strange, unreadable expression in the woman's eyes, he had the sudden, chilling feeling that he had just locked the real storm inside with him. He didn't ask their names. He didn't want to know. Names made people real, and he didn't want them to be real. He just pointed to the rough-hewn table. He took a loaf of bread from the pantry, a hard, dense thing he'd baked days ago out of habit, and slammed it down on the wood. He added a block of cheese and a knife. The girls stared at the food like it was a miracle. Their hands twitched, but they didn't move. They looked to their mother, waiting for a signal. The woman watched him, her gaze intense. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something else, an appraisal. She was studying him, measuring him. Finally, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The girls fell on the food, their small hands tearing at the bread with a desperation that twisted something in Silas's gut. He turned away, staring into the fire, pretending not to see the way they ate, fast and frantic, as if they feared the food would be snatched away at any moment. The only sound in the room was their quiet chewing and the crackle of the logs. It was a fragile human sound in a house that had been filled with nothing but echoes for years. When they were done, the woman finally spoke. "My name is Clara May Dawson," she said, her voice still hoarse but stronger now. "These are my girls, Rosie, June, and Mary." Silas said nothing. He just kept his back to her. "We can work," she continued, her voice gaining a strange sort of formal strength. "I can cook, clean, mend, whatever you need. The girls are good helpers. We will earn our keep. Just don't send us back out there." He finally turned to look at her. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing the hard lines of endurance beneath the exhaustion. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way the town girls were. Her beauty was in the way a weathered rock is beautiful. It had survived. "There's work," he said, his voice flat. "My mother is upstairs. She's been sick. You'll look after her." Clara's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something. Surprise. Fear. Crossing her features before it was gone, replaced by a mask of quiet resolve. "Of course," she said. She herded her daughters, now drowsy with full bellies, toward the warmth of the hearth. They curled up on the rug like puppies, asleep in an instant. Silas watched them, then his gaze shifted back to Clara. She was still watching him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't just a desperate woman seeking shelter. He could see it now. She was a survivor. But surviving in this world often meant making hard choices. It meant carrying secrets. And as he looked at this stranger under his roof, he wondered what secrets she had carried in from the storm. The next morning, the house felt different. It was still dark when Silas woke, but a low fire was already burning, and the smell of coffee, real coffee, hung in the air. He walked into the main room and found Clara moving with a quiet, unnerving efficiency. She had already swept the floors, wiped down the tables, and was now kneading dough on a floured board. She moved like someone who knew that stillness was a luxury she couldn't afford. She didn't look up when he entered. "I found the coffee in the pantry," she said, her voice calm. "I hope you don't mind." Silas just grunted and poured himself a cup. It was strong, hot, and better than any he'd made in years. He watched her for a moment. Her hands, though chapped and red, were deft and sure. There was no hesitation in her movements. This was a woman who knew her way around a kitchen, but there was something else too, a watchfulness. Her eyes, even when focused on the dough, seemed to be aware of everything in the room, including him. Later, she carried a tray of food upstairs. Silas followed, lingering in the doorway of his mother's room. The room was dim, smelling of sickness and stale air. His mother, Martha, was a frail bird of a woman, lost in a sea of blankets. Her breathing was often shallow, her mind wandering. Clara approached the bed, her voice soft. "Mrs. Boone," she said, "I've brought you some breakfast." Martha's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with age, but they sharpened as they focused on Clara. She looked at the tray, a bowl of oatmeal, a slice of toast. Then she looked back at Clara. For a long moment, the old woman just stared, her gaze piercing, as if trying to see into the stranger's soul. Silas tensed in the doorway. His mother had always been a shrewd judge of character. Finally, Martha gave a weak, dry smile. "You have kind hands, child," she whispered, and allowed Clara to spoon-feed her the oatmeal. Silas felt a knot in his chest loosen, but only slightly. His mother might have been fooled by the gentle voice and the warm food, but Silas wasn't so sure. As Clara worked, he noticed things. Small things. The way she always positioned herself so she could see the door. The way she flinched at the sound of a horse outside. The way she never, ever spoke of her husband, or how she came to be wandering in a blizzard with 3 children. She was a closed book, and Silas had a feeling the story inside was not a happy one. He had his own closed book, of course, his own story of loss and regret. Maybe that's why he recognized the shadows in her eyes. They were the same ones he saw in the mirror every morning. But shadows can hide anything. Grief, fear, or something much, much darker. Days bled into weeks. The relentless rhythm of the storm outside was matched by a new rhythm inside the house. Clara was a tireless worker. The house, which had been sinking into a dusty, silent decay, began to breathe again. The floors shone. The windows were clean. The air smelled of baking bread and wood smoke instead of sorrow. The girls, Rosie, June, and Mary, came out of their shells. Their laughter, at first a timid trickle, became a steady stream that echoed through the quiet rooms. Little Mary took to following Silas to the barn, her bright eyes watching him as he worked with the horses. He never spoke to her, but one day he found himself carving a small wooden bird. He left it on the hay bale where she liked to sit. He never saw her pick it up, but the next day it was gone. He pretended not to notice. He kept his distance from all of them, a silent, brooding presence in the corner of the home they were slowly creating. He ate the meals Clara cooked, wore the shirts she mended, and watched as she brought a spark of life back to his ailing mother. But he never said thank you. He never offered a word of praise. He watched, and he waited. He waited for the other shoe to drop. People like Clara, people who appeared out of a storm with nothing but shadows in their eyes, they always had a story, and those stories always had an ending, usually a bad one. The first hint of that ending came when the blizzard finally broke. The snow began to melt, turning the world into a sea of mud. But the road to town was passable again. They were running low on flour and salt. "I'll go," Silas said at breakfast. He didn't want her going to town. He didn't want people asking questions. "No," Clara said, her voice firm. It was the first time she had directly contradicted him. "You're needed here with the livestock. I'll take the girls. It's time they saw something other than these four walls." He wanted to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. It was a flicker of that same steely resolve he'd seen the first night. She was not asking for permission. He hitched the wagon for her, his movements stiff and angry. He didn't like this. He didn't like any of it. He watched them ride away, the three little girls huddled in the back, Clara sitting ramrod straight on the driver's seat. They looked like any other family heading to town for supplies, but they weren't. And Silas had a gut feeling that this trip to town was going to unleash the real storm. Clara returned late that afternoon, her face pale and set like stone. She didn't say a word as she unloaded the supplies, her movements sharp and jerky. The girls were silent, clinging to her skirts, their earlier excitement gone. Silas found Rosie in the barn later, crying softly into a horse's mane. "What happened?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The little girl flinched, then looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. "They were mean to Mama," she whispered. "The lady in the store. She called Mama a bad name." A cold fury started to burn in Silas's chest. He knew the town. He knew the gossip that festered there like a sore. He knew exactly who the lady was. Edna McGrath, a sharp-tongued widow whose only joy in life was spreading misery. That night at dinner, the silence was thick enough to cut with a knife. Clara moved like a ghost, her eyes fixed on the floor. After she put the girls to bed, Silas found her standing by the window, staring out at the dark, snow-covered plains. "You should have let me go," he said. She didn't turn. It wouldn't have mattered. They would have talked anyway. "What did they say?" he pressed. She finally turned to face him, and in the dim lantern light he saw the raw pain in her eyes. "They said I was a beggar, that I'd wormed my way in here to trap a lonely rich man." Her voice broke on the last few words, a bitter, self-mocking laugh escaping her lips. "Rich," she repeated, shaking her head. Silas's jaw tightened. "It's none of their business." "It becomes their business when it's all they have to talk about through a long winter," she shot back, her voice suddenly fierce. "They look at me and they see a woman with no husband, no home, living under a man's roof. They only see one thing." She took a deep, shuddering breath, wrapping her arms around herself. "Perhaps we should leave," she whispered. "The road is clear. We can be gone by morning. You've done more than enough." Silas stared at her. He saw the shame, the hurt, the fierce pride warring in her eyes. He saw a woman who had been beaten down by life but refused to stay down. And he felt something shift inside him, a protective instinct he thought had died long ago. "No," he said, the word coming out like a command. "This is my house. You are under my protection. You're not going anywhere." He expected to see relief in her eyes, but instead he saw a flash of something else. Fear. The same fear he'd seen on the first night. It was gone in an instant, but he'd seen it. And it made him wonder. Was she afraid of the town's gossip? Or was she afraid of what his protection really meant? Was she afraid of being trapped here with him? The town's whispers didn't fade, they grew louder, uglier. Edna McGrath saw to that. She painted Clara as a schemer, a temptress, a woman of loose morals who had taken advantage of a grieving man. The story spread like a sickness, and soon every trip to town was an ordeal. Men would leer at Clara, women would turn their backs, their whispers following her down the street like biting flies. Through it all, Clara held her head high, her face an unreadable mask. But Silas saw the toll it was taking. He saw the new lines of strain around her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. He started doing the trips to town himself, using the excuse that the wagon needed a man's hand on the rough roads. He endured the sly looks and the pointed questions from the men at the general store. "Got yourself a live-in housekeeper now, Boone?" One of them sneered. "Heard she's multi-talented." Silas just stared the man down, his silence more threatening than any words. The man looked away, suddenly very interested in a barrel of pickles. But the poison had spread. It seeped under the door of the ranch, tainting the fragile peace they had built. One evening, Silas came in from the barn to find his mother, Martha, sitting up in bed, her eyes bright with a feverish intensity. "That woman," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "Clara, there's something familiar about her." Silas frowned. "What do you mean, familiar?" "Her eyes," Martha whispered, her gaze distant. "They remind me of someone from a long time ago. A girl from back east. Before we came out here. Before—" Her voice trailed off, and she seemed to shrink back into the pillows, her sudden burst of energy gone. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, and she fell into a troubled sleep, muttering a name Silas couldn't quite catch. He stood there for a long time, a cold unease creeping into his heart. His mother's mind had been wandering for months, mixing up memories, confusing the past and the present. It was probably nothing, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that it was something, that his mother, in her fevered state, had seen something he had missed, a piece of a puzzle he didn't even know he was trying to solve. He started watching Clara more closely after that, not with suspicion exactly, but with a new intensity. He watched the way she cared for his mother, her touch gentle but firm. He watched her with her daughters, her love for them a fierce protective shield. He saw nothing but a good, hard-working woman trying to survive in a world that had dealt her a cruel hand. He tried to dismiss his mother's words as the ramblings of a sick old woman. But the seed of doubt had been planted. One night he was woken by a sound from downstairs. A soft, rhythmic thudding. He grabbed his rifle and crept down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The main room was dark, save for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. The sound was coming from the corner where Clara and her daughters slept on their makeshift pallets. He moved closer, his eyes adjusting to the dark. He could make out Clara's form. She was sitting up, her back to him. The thudding sound was coming from her. She was rocking back and forth, a small, tight movement, and she was crying. Not loud, hysterical sobs, but silent, gut-wrenching tears that shook her whole body. She was holding something in her hands, clutching it to her chest. In the faint firelight, he could just make out what it was. A small carved wooden bird, the one he had made for Mary. He backed away, his own throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. He returned to his room, the image of her silent grief burned into his mind. This was not the crying of a schemer, a temptress. This was the crying of someone who was utterly, completely alone. And in that moment, he realized that he was too. The next day, he made a decision. He found Clara in the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen, though she tried to hide it. "We're going to need more firewood for the winter," he said, his voice gruff. "The girls are old enough to learn how to stack. I'll teach them." It was a clumsy offering, but it was all he had. It was his way of saying, "You're not alone. We're in this together." A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by a small, hesitant smile. It was the first time he had seen her genuinely smile, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long storm. For a few weeks, things were better. The five of them, Silas, Clara, the three girls, settled into a routine that felt less like a temporary arrangement and more like a family. A strange, broken, silent family, but a family nonetheless. But the town was still out there, and the whispers were about to turn into a roar. one that would threaten to tear their fragile world apart. The knock on the door came late one evening, just as another snowstorm was beginning to brew. This time it wasn't a timid scratching, it was a hard, official rap. Silas knew who it was before he even opened the door. Sheriff Amos Carter stood on the porch, his broad shoulders covered in a dusting of snow, his face grim. "Silas," he said, stepping inside and stamping the snow from his boots. His eyes flicked over to Clara, who stood frozen by the hearth, her hand flying to her throat. "Ma'am," he said with a curt nod. Then his gaze returned to Silas. "We need to talk, privately." Silas led him into the small study he rarely used. The sheriff shut the door behind them. "It's bad, Silas," Amos said, his voice low. "The talk in town. It's gotten out of hand. Edna McGrath has been stirring the pot, telling anyone who'll listen that you're living in sin with this widow." Silas's hands clenched into fists. "It's nobody's business." "It is now," the sheriff said, his eyes hard. "A circuit judge is due in a few weeks. Some of the upstanding citizens are talking about filing a formal complaint. For immorality. They could take her children away, Silas." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Take her children. He thought of Rosie, June, and Mary, their laughter now a constant presence in the once silent house. He thought of Clara, her fierce protective love for them. The idea of them being torn apart was monstrous. "They wouldn't," Silas said, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "They might," Amos countered. "People get righteous when they're bored and cold. But that's not the only reason I'm here." The sheriff leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. "A man came through town a few days ago. A stranger, asking questions." A chill went down Silas's spine. "What kind of questions?" "He was asking about you at first, about your wife's accident." Silas flinched as if he'd been struck. Then he started asking about a woman with 3 daughters who might have passed this way. He had a picture. Amos paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "It was a damn good likeness of Mrs. Dawson." The room suddenly felt very cold, and it had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Who was this man?" Silas asked, his voice barely a whisper. The sheriff looked him dead in the eye. He didn't say his name, but he had the look of a Pinkerton agent, or a bounty hunter. "Silas, who is she? Who is this woman you've taken into your home?" Silas felt the floor drop out from under him. A Pinkerton, a bounty hunter. It all clicked into place, her fear, her watchfulness, the way she never talked about her past. She wasn't just a widow down on her luck. She was running from something, someone. "I don't know," Silas said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. Amos studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You better find out," he said finally, "because whatever trouble she's in, it's your trouble now. It's standing right in your living room." The sheriff left, disappearing back into the swirling snow, leaving Silas alone with 1,000 questions and a growing sense of dread. He walked back into the main room. Clara was standing exactly where he had left her, her face a pale mask of anxiety. "What did he want?" she asked, her voice trembling. Silas looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the woman who had brought his house back to life, the woman who cared for his mother with a tenderness he hadn't seen in years, the woman who cried silently in the dark, clutching a small wooden bird. And he saw the woman in the bounty hunter's picture, a woman with a past she was desperate to escape. "He said a man was in town," Silas said, his voice flat, emotionless, "asking about a woman with 3 children. He watched her face. He saw the color drain from it, saw the flicker of sheer panic in her eyes before she crushed it, burying it deep. He saw her hands clench at her sides. He saw the truth she had been hiding. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stared at him, her eyes pleading. Pleading for what? For him to believe her. For him to protect her. For him to not ask the question that hung in the air between them. He didn't ask it. He didn't want to know. Not yet. Because he knew that once the truth was spoken, there would be no going back. "Get some sleep," he said, turning away from her and staring into the fire. "There's a storm coming." He was talking about the snow, but they both knew he wasn't. The real storm was here. It had a name. It had a face, and it was coming for Clara, which meant it was coming for all of them. The days that followed were filled with a tense, suffocating silence. Clara and Silas moved around each other like ghosts, the unspoken truth a chasm between them. The bounty hunter, the picture, the lie. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows made Clara jump. She spent her days working with a frantic energy, as if by keeping her hands busy, she could keep her mind from splintering. Silas watched her, his heart a knot of conflicting emotions. He was angry at her for bringing this danger to his door. He was terrified for her and the girls. And a part of him he didn't want to acknowledge was fiercely, irrationally protective of her. He found himself scanning the horizon from the barn loft, watching the road, his rifle never far from his side. He was no longer just a grieving rancher, he was a sentry, a guard. One night he couldn't take the silence anymore. He found her mending one of his shirts by the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering light. The girls were asleep. The house was still. "You have to tell me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Who are you running from, Clara?" She didn't look up from her sewing, but her hands stilled. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she took a deep, shuddering breath, and the story came spilling out, a torrent of hushed, hurried words. Her husband, Daniel, hadn't been a farmer, as she had implicitly let him believe. He had been a gambler, a cheat. He'd gotten himself into debt with a dangerous man in St. Louis, a man named Elias Thorne. Thorne wasn't just a businessman, he ran a powerful criminal syndicate. He was ruthless, violent, and he didn't tolerate being crossed. Daniel, in a desperate attempt to clear his debt, had tried to cheat Thorne. He was caught. As a punishment, Thorne didn't just kill him, he made an example of him. But before he died, Daniel confessed to Clara that he had stolen something from Thorne. Not just money, a ledger. A book containing the names of every corrupt official, every judge, every lawman on Thorne's payroll. It was the one thing that could bring Thorne's entire empire crashing down. Daniel had hidden it somewhere before he was caught. He died without telling Clara where. "Thorne doesn't believe me," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "He thinks I know where it is. He sent his men. They tore our house apart. They threatened my girls." She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a terror that made his blood run cold. "So I ran. I took the girls and I just ran. I've been running for months, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks. I thought out here, in the middle of nowhere, he would never find us. The man in town," Silas said, the pieces clicking into place. "The bounty hunter. He works for Thorne." Clara nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "He will have sent word back by now. Thorne will know where I am. He will come." She looked at Silas, her expression stripped bare of all pretense. It was the look of a trapped animal. "You have to send us away," she said, her voice breaking. "Now, before he gets here. You and your mother, you're not safe as long as we're here." Silas stared at her, the story echoing in the silent room. He should have been afraid. He should have been furious. He should have thrown her out into the snow, saving himself from the violence that was hurtling toward them. But as he looked at her, at this woman who had fought and clawed her way across the country to protect her children, he didn't feel fear or anger. He felt a grudging, profound respect. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that he wasn't going to send her away. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I told you. You are under my protection." He walked over to the fireplace and picked up his rifle, checking the action with a practiced, steady hand. "Let him come," he said, his eyes as cold and hard as the winter outside. "We'll be ready for him." The waiting was the worst part. Every dawn felt like a reprieve, every dusk a threat. Silas and Clara became a silent team, their shared secret forging a strange, unspoken bond between them. They worked to fortify the ranch, their movements economical and purposeful. Silas boarded up some of the downstairs windows, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. Clara, to his surprise, showed him how to melt down lead and cast bullets. Her hands were as steady as his. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, watching her pour the molten metal into the mold. My father taught me, she said, her eyes not leaving her work. He was a soldier. He said a woman should know how to defend her home, not just keep it. There were layers to this woman he was only just beginning to uncover. She was not just a mother and a homemaker. She was a fighter. She was a survivor. He started teaching her how to shoot the rifle. She was a natural. Her hands didn't tremble. Her aim was true. As she stood beside him, reloading the weapon with a calm efficiency, he saw her not as a victim, but as an ally, an equal. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface of their daily chores, but it was now overlaid with a grim determination. They were no longer just waiting to be attacked. They were preparing for a battle. The girls sensed the change. They grew quiet, their laughter silenced by the tension that gripped the house. They watched Silas and Clara with wide, worried eyes, understanding that the world had shrunk to the four walls of this cabin, and that something dangerous was waiting outside. One evening, as Silas stood watch by the window, his mother called to him from her room. Her voice was weak but clear. "Silas," she said when he came to her bedside, "the name, I remember the name." He leaned closer. "What name, mother?" "The girl," she whispered, her eyes cloudy but focused. The girl with Clara's eyes. Her name was Annabelle. Annabelle Thorne. The name hit Silas like a physical blow. Thorne. She was the daughter of a businessman from St. Louis, Martha continued, her voice a faint, reedy whisper. "A cruel man. Your father did business with him once. Once. He said the man had ice in his veins. Annabelle. She fell in love with a young lawman, a deputy. They were going to run away together, but her father found out. He forbade it. The girl. She died. They said it was a fever, but I always wondered." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. A lawman. A deputy. He straightened up, a horrifying suspicion taking root in his mind. He walked to the old chest at the foot of his bed. His hands trembled as he opened it. He pushed aside old clothes, a faded Bible, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a tarnished silver star. A deputy's badge. He stared at it, the memories flooding back. A girl with dark, haunted eyes. A ruthless father. A failed plan. A tragic death. He had buried that part of his life so deep, he had almost forgotten it. He had run to Montana to escape the ghost of the man he used to be, the man who had failed to save the woman he loved. Annabelle Thorne, the daughter of Elias Thorne, the man who was now hunting Clara. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a ghost from his past, rising from the grave. He looked from the badge in his hand to the doorway, where Clara stood watching him, her face a question. And he realized the storm that was coming wasn't just about a stolen ledger. It was about him. It had always been about him. Elias Thorne wasn't just coming for Clara, he was coming for revenge. The truth hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Silas explained it all, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. Annabelle, her father, Elias Thorne, his own past as a deputy in St. Louis. The love, the failed escape, the guilt that had driven him into self-imposed exile. Clara listened, her face pale, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. "So he's not just hunting me," she whispered. "He's hunting you." "He's using you to get to me," Silas corrected, his voice grim. "He must have found out you were headed west, put his bounty hunters on your trail. When they reported you were here, with me, it must have seemed like fate to him, a chance to settle an old score." "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice small, the fight seemingly drained out of her. For the first time since she had arrived, she looked truly defeated. Silas looked at her, at the girls sleeping peacefully by the fire, unaware of the ghosts that were converging on their little sanctuary. He looked at the rifle in his hands, at the boarded-up windows. He had run from his past once. He had let it destroy him, hollow him out. He would not run again. "We fight," he said, the words simple, absolute. A strange calm settled over him. The waiting was over. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. This was not just about survival anymore. This was about redemption. The next day, the snow began to fall again, thick and heavy, blanketing the world in a silent shroud of white. It was the perfect cover. They wouldn't be able to see them coming until it was too late. That afternoon, as Silas was checking the perimeter of the barn, he saw it. A single rider on the ridge, a dark silhouette against the grey sky. He wasn't moving, just watching. A scout. They were here. He ran back to the house, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "They're here," he said to Clara as he burst through the door. "One rider on the ridge, the rest will be coming soon." Clara's face was white, but her hands were steady as she picked up the second rifle. She herded the girls upstairs to Martha's room. "Stay with your grandmother," she told them, her voice calm despite the terror in her eyes. "Bar the door. Do not come out no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" The girls nodded, their eyes wide with fear. Rosie, the eldest, hugged her mother fiercely. "I love you, Mama." "I love you too," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Now go." She watched them disappear up the stairs, then turned to face Silas. The two of them stood alone in the main room, the silence broken only by the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. They were outnumbered, they were trapped. A grieving rancher and a desperate widow against a small army of ruthless killers. The odds were impossible. But as Silas looked at Clara, standing beside him, her rifle held at the ready, her jaw set with a fierce determination, he knew they would not go down without a fight. The first shot shattered the evening stillness, ripping through the window and burying itself in the wall just inches from Silas's head. The siege had begun. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a chaos of swirling snow and muzzle flashes. They were surrounded. Silas could hear their shouts, muffled by the wind, as they moved through the trees, closing in. He and Clara took up positions at opposite ends of the room, each covering a set of windows. "Stay low," he yelled over the sound of splintering wood as another bullet tore through the wall. "Don't fire until you have a clear shot. We need to make every bullet count." The first figure appeared out of the blizzard, a dark shape moving toward the porch. Silas raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and squeezed the trigger. The roar of the gun filled the small cabin. The figure outside crumpled into the snow and didn't move. A scream of rage went up from the attackers. They answered with a volley of fire, bullets thudding into the logs of the cabin like angry fists. Silas and Clara held their ground, firing sparingly, methodically. They were a surprisingly effective team. He would fire, then move, while she covered him. Then she would fire, and he would cover her. They moved in a deadly dance, their movements synchronized by adrenaline and a shared will to survive. But there were too many of them. For every one they hit, two more seemed to take his place. A bullet ripped through Silas's sleeve, grazing his arm. He grunted in pain, but didn't stop. He saw a man trying to circle around to the back of the house. He aimed, fired, and the man fell. He glanced over at Clara. Her face was smudged with gunpowder, her eyes blazing with a ferocious light. She was reloading, her hands moving with a speed and precision that amazed him. This was not a woman to be trifled with. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the storm, the heavy thud of an axe against the front door. They were trying to break it down. "They're coming through the door," Silas yelled. "Get back." They both scrambled away from the windows, taking cover behind the heavy oak table Silas had overturned. The axe blows grew louder, more frantic. Wood splintered. The heavy bar holding the door began to groan. Any second now, the door would burst open and they would be overrun. Just then, a different sound joined the fray, the thunder of hoofbeats and a voice bellowing through the storm. "Silas, hold on." It was Sheriff Carter. He wasn't alone. Through the swirling snow, Silas could see a small group of riders, maybe half a dozen, charging out of the trees, their guns blazing. The townspeople. They had come. The attackers, caught between the fortified cabin and the surprise attack from their rear, were thrown into confusion. Their assault on the door faltered. Elias Thorne's men were killers, not soldiers. They weren't prepared for a real fight. They began to fall back, scattering into the woods like frightened crows. The gunfire dwindled, then stopped altogether. The only sounds were the moaning of the wind and the pained cries of a wounded man somewhere out in the darkness. It was over, at least for now. The front door, battered but holding, remained shut. Silas and Clara looked at each other, their chests heaving, the adrenaline slowly beginning to fade. They had survived, But as the silence settled over the cabin, a new, more terrifying sound reached them. A child's scream coming from upstairs. Silas's blood ran cold. He and Clara scrambled for the stairs, their hearts pounding with a new kind of fear. The door to Martha's room was swinging open, the bar on the floor, broken. Inside, the room was a wreck. A window was shattered, snow swirling in. Martha was slumped in her bed, a dark stain spreading across her white nightgown, and in the center of the room stood Elias Thorne. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man, his face a mask of cold fury. In one hand he held a smoking pistol. In the other he held little Mary, her small body pressed against him as a shield, his arm wrapped tight around her throat. The girl's terrified sobs filled the room. Thorne's eyes, cold and dead as a shark's, found Silas. "Boone," he hissed, the name dripping with years of hatred. "I should have killed you when I had the chance. You took my daughter from me. Now I'll take everything from you." "Let the girl go, Thorne," Silas said, his voice dangerously low, his rifle aimed at the man's chest. "It's me you want." Thorne laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, I'll get to you. But first, I want what is mine. The ledger. Your woman has it. Give it to me, or the child dies." "I don't have it," Clara cried, her face a mess of tears and desperation. "I never did." "Liar!" Thorne screamed, his grip tightening on Mary. The little girl let out a choked cry. "Enough!" A weak voice rasped from the bed. It was Martha. Her eyes were open, glittering with a fierce, defiant light. She was pressing a hand to her side, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "You won't find it, Elias," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Because it's not here." Thorne's head whipped around to face her. "What did you say, old woman?" "The ledger," Martha said, a faint, triumphant smile on her lips. "Daniel didn't give it to Clara. He was smarter than that. He sent it to the one person he knew he could trust. The one person he knew would use it to see you hang." She coughed, a spray of blood dotting her lips. "He sent it to Sheriff Amos Carter." The color drained from Thorne's face. He stared at the old woman, then at Silas, then at Clara, his mind racing. He had been tricked. He had walked into a trap. In that split second of hesitation, Silas saw his chance. He fired. The shot was deafening in the small room. Thorne staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face. His grip on Mary loosened. Clara lunged forward, snatching her daughter away from him. Thorne stared down at the red stain spreading across his pristine white shirt. He looked up at Silas, his eyes filled with a black, bottomless hatred. He raised his pistol to fire again, but he was too slow. Another shot rang out, this one from the doorway. Sheriff Carter stood there, his own pistol smoking. Thorne crumpled to the floor, his reign of terror finally over. Silas rushed to his mother's side. "Mother," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Martha reached up, her frail hand touching his cheek. "Annabel would be proud of you," she whispered. Her eyes fluttered closed, and with a final gentle sigh, she was gone. The room was silent, save for the sound of Mary's quiet sobs in her mother's arms. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, but the cost had been unbearably high. In the aftermath, the story came out. Sheriff Carter confirmed it all. The ledger had arrived in a plain package weeks ago, with an anonymous note. He had been quietly building a case, waiting for the circuit judge. Thorne's attack on the ranch was the final piece of evidence he needed. The town, shamed by its gossip and stunned by the violence, rallied around Silas and Clara. Edna McGraw was silenced, her cruel whispers replaced by a grudging respect. The men who had sneered at Clara now tipped their hats. They saw her not as a beggar, but as a hero. They buried Martha in the small churchyard next to Silas's first wife. The whole town came to pay their respects. As Silas stood by the grave, Clara came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. Her daughters stood with them, a new, unlikely family forged in fire and loss. The ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of peace. The house bore the scars of the battle, the splintered door, the bullet holes in the walls, but it felt more like a home than ever before. One evening, weeks later, Silas found Clara by the fire, just as he had on that first night. She was humming a soft tune, mending one of Mary's dresses. He sat down beside her. For a long time they said nothing, simply watching the flames dance. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice soft. "For everything. You saved me, Clara," he said, his own voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You and the girls. You brought this house. You brought me back to life." He reached out and took her hand. It was calloused and rough from work, but to him it was the most beautiful thing in the world. She laced her fingers through his, her touch warm and sure. The winter was finally ending, the snow was melting, revealing the green shoots of new life beneath. And in the quiet warmth of the ranch house, two souls, once lost in their own private winters, had finally found their spring. They had found it in the most unexpected of places, in each other. Their pasts had been filled with darkness, but together they had found a way to step into the light, proving that sometimes the deepest scars can lead to the strongest love. It just goes to show you that even in the coldest, most unforgiving places, a single act of kindness can spark a fire that changes everything. Silas Boone thought he was just opening his door to a storm, but he was really opening it to his own salvation. And Clara Dawson, running from a nightmare, ran straight into the one place she could finally be safe. Their story is a powerful reminder that the family you choose can be stronger than the one you're born into, and that true courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about facing it down to protect the ones you love. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, and if you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you don't miss our next strange and mysterious tale. Thanks for watching.